We're based in San Francisco in the Mission District. We started by colliding games and film together. So we didn't even really know what it meant when Zach first asked us. We're now working with AI engineers to do predictive math in terms of the intention of the audience. We needed you to participate in that story. We can use body language, or we can use dance, or we can use theatrical lighting. We've sort of been granted these superpowers, I feel like. There's just so much power in being able to feel emotion viscerally. You feel like you're there with your best friend about to embark on this adventure through sound, through presence, through misdirection. It was immersive theater that really led us down the right path. He does throw out these sort of grandiose ideas. If a character has an ongoing memory of you, character does make a lot of sense as the way that we will interface the world. I have to give myself permission to think about the future.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Sky, the host of the Immersion Nation podcast. Here, the masters of immersive experience create and conjure, muse, and imagine the cultural revolution that is unfolding before us. That is immersive entertainment. Welcome. Hello. I wanted to take just a little extra time to introduce this week's guest, one Pete Billington. Pete's career started in 2002 working on Star Wars Attack of the Clones. From there, he worked on The Matrix Reloaded, War of the Worlds, and Polar Express, just to name a few of the projects he's been involved in. Pete had lived on the edge of visual storytelling and wanted to stay there, so he jumped headfirst into VR, joining the Oculus story team. When it was decided by the Facebook overlords that the story team would be dissolved, Pete decided that the gloves were coming off. Instead of letting the team that they had worked with for so long disperse into the entertainment ether, the team decided to continue the project they were in the midst of. Well, how better to do that than to co-found your own VR company? Thus, Fable Studios was born. Pete and the Fable team are no longer on the edge of visual media. It's safe to say that they are indeed in the business of defining it. Please enjoy this conversation with Pete Billington. All right. Pete, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course. Appreciate you taking the time today. As is tradition, I think we'll start with a brief question about your favorite fictional world. So if you had to choose a fictional world of some variety, fictional or fantasy world, to live in, to spend some time in, what world would that be?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because there's so many amazing fictional universes, and I've had moments in my life where I've focused heavily on certain ones or become addicted to them. But I think Dungeons and Dragons would probably be the most interesting for me because it's just so open ended, and there's this amazing feedback loop with people participating and creating the world as it goes, and it's just so diverse. And I just had this sort of childhood memory of how amazing and so open-ended that was. It's one of my favorite sort of fantasy experiences, was just being this little kid and not knowing what was around every corner.
Yeah, most definitely. And in so many ways, I kind of feel like Gary Gygax really is one of the fathers of immersive experience for that very reason.
Totally.
Um, so I have to ask, what do you have a particular class that you played or typically play within D&D?
We're going back a long way, and I feel like it's evolved so much from when I played. I have all my original modules, and they're not the first generation, but they are like the second generation of D&D. And so there wasn't a lot to choose from, but I think I was obsessed with the paladin character because it was, you had a little bit of magic, you had a little bit of fighter, you were in this adventurer, and then reading Tolkien later on, it's like, oh, this is clearly, trying to be Aragorn at the time, probably. But yeah,
Oh yeah,
it was it was a cool class at the time.
most definitely. All right, so I'm wondering, insofar as kind of explaining to listeners a little bit about Wolves in the Walls and experience. I wonder if maybe a good way to kind of get at that is starting with the question that the folks from Third Rail asked you guys when they came in, being what having, now spent some time with that question, is the major dramatic question for Wolves in the Walls?
Yeah, it's so interesting because when they first asked us that question, we didn't know how to answer it. The studio that ultimately built Wolves was sort of half game people from the games industry and half movie people, specifically from feature animation. And we deal with things like, what's the game mechanic, or what's the catalyst for the story, or what's the climax of the third act. But we had never heard that language around major dramatic question, which is uh, clearly a theater premise. And so we didn't even really know what it meant when Zach first asked us that. But ultimately, he gave a great example of what it was for Then She Fell, which is, things are going to unfold and it's up to you to decide what they mean. And we thought that that was a fascinating way to approach a project in terms of it places a lot of onus on the audience and who the audience is. And it led us to sort of casting the audience. Um, and so we kind of arrived at, this is Lucy's story. We really wanted to make it about her, but we needed you to participate in that story. And so we sort of imagined you as Lucy's imaginary friend. And it's to really determine what is real and what might be imaginary. And in the end, is that important? And what can you infer about the relationships of this family based on what you observe and what your senses are telling you, which draws you further into the experience.
Yeah, yeah. And it really is such an intimate space to be drawn into a family's home and seeing it then kind of as you have spoken to about, hey, you lose all of these cinematic techniques, but you gain this ability to see the world through the lens of this character that you're interacting with.
Hmm.
Um, so you not only get the intimate space of a familial context, but you also get that through her eyes with having the father on stage and then coming progressively closer and more accessible, and then similar mechanics with the mother character. And by the way, for context, though I am incredibly excited to do so, I have not yet experienced Wolves in the Walls. So my understanding and background knowledge is coming from that of, say, the audience who maybe has not participated in Wolves in the Walls also, and also just from doing a little bit of research
Hmm.
on the work that you guys have done.
Yeah, it's so hard to talk about this medium because it is so experiential, and we do lament the fact that we've lost a lot of traditional storytelling skills, but in turn we've sort of been granted these superpowers, I feel like, and we're discovering them as we go. But there's just so much power in being able to feel emotion viscerally through sound, through presence, through misdirection. It's like being in a play or a theatrical play, but for one person. Like, if an entire production was just made for you, that's what we're trying to accomplish. So you are granted all of these superpowers, and it's just so hard to sort of talk about this in the language that we use to describe a book or a film or or a television show.
Just anything with a fourth wall. And
Yeah.
for context, are you guys based in LA or San Fran? I wasn't quite able to figure that out.
Yeah, we're based in San Francisco in the Mission District. We have a small studio. It's roughly about 20 people working on the project.
Wonderful, yeah. And I mean, have you experienced much of the immersive theater stuff that's going on in LA? I know there's definitely some with Epic Immersive happening in the San Fran area as well.
Yeah, I would say, my two favorite places to see content are LA and New York, and San Francisco is a close third. But LA's really just got a lot of momentum right now, and there's so many cool things. I don't get down there as much as I would like to, but I've been sort of intentionally scheduling trips just to see theater and stuff down there.
Yeah. Momentum is right. They're definitely picking up, especially coming from, New York kind of being the staple initially that had
Mm-hmm.
Then She Fell and Sleep No More, et cetera, et cetera. Just
Yeah.
really incredible to watch kind of the I'm not sure if conflation is the right word, but just the kind of intersplicing of the immersive theater world with the VR world and kind of looking at the juxtaposition between the two because so many folks from immersive theater are very much, hey, this like VR is something that it's difficult to capture the personal context until I feel like you probably experience something like Wolves on the Walls, and then that just changes one's perspective quite a bit.
Yeah, it was really the secret ingredient for us. I think, as I mentioned, we started by colliding games and film together, thinking that with the real time component of virtual reality and the fact that you have the use of your hands, specifically in Wolves, like we had a lot of game type things to solve, and we wanted to obviously tell a good story. So it made sense to really start from the perspective of like how do you write a screenplay, but we found out that very early on the process we were kind of both just stuck in our ways, and there was a lot of good conflict in terms of like, well, we solve this through play testing, and well, we solve this through radio play and through story development. And it was immersive theater that really led us down the right path in terms of how to solve a lot of these problems. And that convergence was it gave us just sort of a common compass reading, and we both factions sort of fell in love with this idea of intimacy and that sort of special one-on-one engagement that you have in some of the best immersive theater, where it feels like, man, this was just for me. Same way like a magic trick is just performed for one person a lot of the time, and that gave us like a lot of confidence, and again, just a common language to talk about. How would we solve this problem? Well, we can use body language, or we can use dance, or we can use theatrical lighting to solve some of the problems that are really almost unsolvable if you use these traditional film or game techniques. And it's a much different problem to solve when the person is in control of essentially where the camera is pointing. They're in control of their own attention span. And those things are really important when you're trying to do like comedic timing or interaction. So we made a lot of mistakes early on, but immersive theater was a really bright light for us to focus on.
Yeah, and there's so many you've spoken a lot about trust and using the trust in the character in order to keep an audience member on that golden path.
Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that you'd kind of or that you've had to pull out every trick in the book, so to speak, in order to, make sure that people are, organically going where they're supposed to go, doing what they're supposed to do, trusting the experience rather than trying to, break it apart. What are some of those tricks that you guys used, to keep people there?
Yeah, specifically with trust, I always thought it was interesting. Is you try to trust the character from a story perspective, but the character also needs to trust you. Again, if we're asking you to play a role, we really want the character to feel like they're including you in the experience. And so from the very beginning of Wolves, the writing, all of the dialogue, the moments that we introduce you to Lucy, the main character, it's about establishing a bond so that later when we're asking you to do more sophisticated things or even, some scary things, you feel like you're there with your best friend about to embark on this adventure. So that was a huge component. But I think in terms of like all of the tricks, we definitely look at body language a lot. We look at nonverbal communication. We've coined this term emotional point of view, and because we're her imaginary friend, we sort of see the world the way that Lucy feels the world. And that means that if she's scared or even pretending to be scared, we can manipulate the space, such that it's another nonverbal cue of how to behave in that environment, or a way to connect to her, sort of her emotional state, but in a visual way. Of course, we know that sound is an incredibly powerful motivator. So we have this amazing audio team that's partnered with us to sort of do all of these audio prompts that help us pay attention to like what we really want you to look at, since we again can't control what you're looking at any given moment. We also use light as an attractor. So it is a lot of theatrical technique that we draw upon, but also looking at mechanism from games. We try to make all of the loops that you would have normally in a game completely invisible. So yes, Lucy will wait for you occasionally to make a decision, but then she has her own agency, which is a very different thing than a game, which a character would typically wait for you to make the right decision. Lucy has her own opinion about what should happen, and she'll just keep going. So the story will always advance regardless of the choices that you make. And it's just this delicate balance of, we want you to feel like your choices matter, and they do matter, but we also want to make it feel like it's this little girl's story, and she's not just going to wait for you to be the main character in her story.
Yeah, most definitely. I really I got a kick out of the whole the uh, the handing of the object and that loop that is the character is sitting there and trying to give this thing repeatedly. It's like there's only so much you can do to get around that, and then working with the process of being like, oh hey, there are certain things we can do to make that a more kind of socially socially normal, with less of that what is it? Not uncanny valley, but because you think of it rather as the inconsistent valley.
Yeah, I actually spent the first half of my career working in both visual effects and animation, and sort of riding that line of both of those, and worked on some movies where the characters were entirely digital, but they also looked very human, human skin and realistic lighting. And that traditionally falls into this category of the uncanny valley, which was a term coined by a robotic professor who noted that the closer something gets to reality, the more creepy it looks. In some cases, when you don't quite hit that perfect version of a human. And in my experience, it does exist, and people react very strongly to it, but it has a lot more to do with the inconsistencies in the character. So you may be able to render perfect skin, but the highlights in the eyes may be incorrect, or the way that the hair is drawn is incorrect. And it's those contrasts and those differences that are actually creating the sense of uncanniness. And so that's kind of why I refer to it as the inconsistent valley. But that extends well beyond the visual nature of a virtual character or virtual being. It's really about the way they talk, the way they engage, those social norms that we talked about. So if they're handing an object to you and they just hold it out there with a dead stare, that's going to break presence, and that's going to be a clue that this thing isn't real. And we do everything we can to hide those sort of technical glitches and make them natural. And so it can be the way that she hands the object, it can be how long she waits, but putting the systems in place to hide those things are incredibly sophisticated. We're now working with AI engineers to do predictive math in terms of what the intention of the audience is, so that they, if they're looking at the object and their hand is starting to move, then we can successfully measure like the likelihood of their intent to grab it versus they're just sort of staring off into space, or they've glanced at it once. We think the likelihood will be less, and so we hold those loops for a long, less time. It's also really awkward if the character holds something out and then takes it away right as you're reaching for it, because that has different social implications. So just to
Yeah, totally.
to create this sort of seamless, what we call natural intuitive interaction, there's a ton of math and programming and thought underneath the hood, but we try and make it look as simple as possible. And I think that's the real magic trick.
Yeah, and there's so many layers to that insofar as making that seem natural. But insofar as communication, so to speak a little bit about kind of the path that has led you to doing all this incredible stuff with Fable, you came through Skywalker Ranch, started there to working on the sequels of the Matrix, then spent some time with DreamWorks, and then, of course, into or through Facebook and Oculus, and now into the independent thing that is Fable. Through all that time, you've looked at so many different types and pieces and down to such a granular level of what communication looks like, communication to an audience, communication with character. How do you feel that your own communication has changed in the last 10 to 15 years? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's been this wonderful ride, and I've been super fortunate to watch, really talented artists and storytellers work. And it'd be impossible to sort of dissect like where all those lessons came from. But I do talk a lot about convergence, and it feels like virtual reality and artificial characters are sort of where all of those things have converged. And I think, yeah, from the spectacle of all those Star Wars movies, and certainly like the early efforts on the Matrix and a lot of the films with Robert Zemeckis, where they were just pushing the envelope of what was possible with motion capture, you start to see. I think probably the most important lesson was you start to see and figure out where the edges of technology are, where the illusion breaks, and rather than forcing what technology is capable of in the moment, use the hybrid of storytelling and technology to find that sweet spot. Like, what is the technology really good at right now? And what does it really suck at right now? And then use your storytelling skills to sort of weave through that and thread the needle, because there'll be times where you really want the technology to save the day, and it's not going to, because it's just not there yet. And it's easy to lie to yourself about like, oh, if we just push a little harder, or if we spend enough time, we'll get this face to look perfect. And you'll do it for like one moment, but to sustain that over the storyline, for the entire duration of the experience, is too much to ask for. And so that's when you can lean on your storytelling skills and write around the limitation in the technology. And we do that all the time in Wolves. And I think that's probably, in terms of communicating to the audience, the biggest lesson that I've learned in sort of being on the edge of what's possible for so long, is that you can really easily fall into the trap, or that uncanny valley, or that inconsistent valley, if you just think we can do this with the tech. And in reality, Wolves is just as much, 1,000-year-old technology as it is cutting edge technology, in terms of how do you tell a good story? How do you create suspense? How do you misdirect the audience? We look just as much at illusion, and mentalism and dance as we did at artificial intelligence and real time render engines. So I think just picking up on those lessons, and quite honestly, making that many mistakes where, we would work for 3 years on a feature film, and it wouldn't be successful because we were too ambitious and we tried to push the envelope too hard. Now everyone benefits as a result, because the next movie is that much better. And that's how technology works. But there is a sweet spot there where you can use other techniques to save the day.
yeah. And I'm curious, do you ever find any of kind of what you've learned in communication, like creeping into your own conversations when you're just speaking with people? Do you find yourself almost like monitoring, like, oh, hey, I just did this and this communicates that
Yeah,
incidentally?
it's super awkward, and to be sort of, especially right when you're in the middle of a project, you become super self-aware of all of that. And I think most people, if you ask them about just my personal day-to-day demeanor, I'm kind of a storyteller in general. I almost speak in anecdotes, and but you start to dissect that, and it bleeds into every aspect of my life. I'll be watching a show. I tried to watch Stranger Things last night, and when you're super tuned into storytelling, you're like, oh, well, that's going to be this moment, and this is what's going to happen next, and you almost have to deprogram yourself, in some ways, just to enjoy other people's work. And I find in the heat of production, I can't watch anything because I'm so sensitive to just the storytelling techniques and how they're doing things. I can't get into the moment because I'm just there dissecting how it works. And it takes quite a while to get back to just to a pure sort of enjoyment phase of media consumption.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, do you have any tricks to do that? Because I definitely know, um, for example, with my lens, with specifically being a little bit more aware of immersive theater, when you go into an experience, you start to kind of look at things that way. Do you have
Hmm.
any like tips or tricks or anything that you personally use to kind of bump yourself back out of that so you can go back and appreciate the magic?
Yeah, I think I do two things. I slow things down, and one of the ways I slow things down is by reading like a longer format story. I actually read a book about books called What We See When We Read, and it was
Ooh,
fascinating about
interesting.
how as we're reading, because information is much slower paced, we are constantly adjusting our view of a character, because we get one sentence and then we form an image in our mind of what that character might look like, and then we get more information. And I actually picked up one of my son's books recently, and it I couldn't tell if the main character was male or female for the first 10 pages, and I thought, oh, that's so brilliant, because it's drawing out sort of this image in your mind, and you're making conclusions, and you might identify with the character one way or another, but there's no clear cut sort of explanation or description that we're sort of force fed in these faster formats. So I think that's one technique, is just take a book and sort of slow down your creative process so that you're letting your imagination engage more. And then the other thing I do is I typically pick up something that I know nothing about. um, so I've been fascinated with the concept of memory lately, and I've been just reading books on cognitive science and how memories are formed in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go back into a learning mode, you you sort of let go of your assumptions of the things that you're so confident in terms of maybe storytelling, or in your case immersive theater, which then allows you to see things in a new way, and you might relate to the thing that you're learning about. So now I see things in the context of memory as opposed to three-act structure, for example. And it lets me enjoy them in a new way, or in a deeper way. So I think those are two techniques that I've found, but it is truly hard, especially since I'm going to so many film festivals, and there's just top caliber content that I want to watch and enjoy, but I'm so wrapped up in the creation of our own work that it's really hard to digest it at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, one experience that might kind of key into both memory and the something new side of things is if you ever have a chance while you're in LA, check out Tales by Candlelight. Um,
Awesome.
the creator is Christoph Vester, and he actually started as a candle maker, but
Hmm.
he has spent a lot of time as a narrator, as a storyteller, and as a dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons. And so, at some point in time, he came along and kind of fused these two things, and he uses his knowledge of scent and scent as it evokes emotional reactions and evokes memory to create narratives in this experience. And that's a something that you might find interesting in that realm just because of the way that he uses scent to, as the most closely linked sense to memory, um, to represent places rather than individual things. And then those places oftentimes are modeled off of things that find themselves into just everybody's kind of common memory and then leveraging that into narrative, something super fascinating.
So
So
cool.
for what that
Yeah.
might be worth.
Yeah. That's so cool.
Um, all right. So as we are moving along here, I think it might be a good time to shift gears a little bit and potentially jump into the make it immersive segment.
Awesome.
Um, so insofar as using the nebulous world of Dungeons and Dragons, I'm curious what your lens for that would be insofar as kind of having a character-driven experience, because it is so much about the party and about this evolving world. Like, how would you turn that into something that you have a character anchor to work with as you're building your own character and understanding yourself inside of that?
Yeah, I think this is something that we're actively pursuing, not directly, not Dungeons and Dragons, but more as a metaphor of how do you start to understand um, who the audience is. And I I'm super fascinated by the ability of immersive theater performers in general to thin slice, like how good they are at picking up on subtle cues. Um, in fact, I was talking to one performer who does, maybe 10 shows a week, maybe a few less, but over the course of her career, she's done the same scene, hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. And
Oh,
she's
who,
got,
if you don't mind me asking?
her name is Lisa Davis, and she's actually the character embodiment of Lucy. So
Oh, yeah, certainly.
the physical, she does the physical performance of Lucy. We used motion capture, um, and so she's gotten to a point with certain scenes where you know these are organic scenes and they will unfold in a way that you know you can't control. So you have the ability to improv, but she says that often she'll know exactly and intuitively how that scene is going to unfold within maybe the first 10 to 15 seconds of engaging an
Wow.
audience member because of decisions and nonverbal and just like subconscious stuff. And so that, I think, a world like Dungeons and Dragons like opens up all of that potential. And I always think about this as, a digital experience because that's what my background is. So if we're talking about, how would you get essentially a computer program or a digital character to have those sorts of superpowers? Well, you start to learn about the personality of, a person playing their character. Is their character introverted? Is it extroverted? Is it impulsive? And that's how we, those rating systems in Dungeons and Dragons, we have chaotic neutral. We know, whether they're going to make certain decisions based on their demeanor. We know how dexterous they are. We know what their constitution is and how strong they are. And then you have a probability system that lays on top of that. All of those things are data points that we collect, you know, as performers, as storytellers with our audience. Even if you strip it down to the most basic function, we're sitting around a campfire and there's a storyteller there. That storyteller is gauging the attention of their audience. They're gauging the dilation of their eyes. They're gauging whether people are leaning forward or closing their eyes or leaning back. All of that is super relevant information to the storyteller to know how to twist and turn the story. And so for a world like Dungeons and Dragons, where you have both audience members who are playing a role, sometimes they're playing themselves, sometimes they're playing the best version of themselves, sometimes they're playing the antithesis of themselves. They're exploring personalities that they aren't comfortable having in real life. And then you have a master storyteller, a dungeon master, who can pick up on all those things and is then using a basic framework to contain the story. It seems like the perfect sort of format, whether the uh, the fantasy element is the way you go or you but as long as you're applying that framework, it seems like an amazing evolution of how storytelling is going to be in the future because it will feel like this is made just for you. And I'm very confident that the trend that we're heading towards is content that feels personal. For those of us who have had the opportunity to be in immersive theater and really good immersive theater, we crave those one-on-one experiences that feel like completely like special. And I think a a world like D&D, that is sort of picking up on all of those nonverbal cues, remembering things. Now we have the ability to have natural language processing and computer vision, picking up on the things you say and on the things you wrote down or the things you draw. There's just so many magic tricks we can do with that stuff. So that's the future that we're imagining and starting to work on.
Yeah, I love it, and especially in the context of the whole, hey, this is a role-playing world where you're playing a character that is either, close to who you are or very different, and the idea of having a dungeon master or maybe an AI of some variety that can interpret the way that you are acting or failing to act like your character, and then maybe like enforcing that, or maybe not enforcing, is that might not be the right language for it, but having an agent within that as a storyteller that can be like, hey, well, that was something strange. Your character wouldn't say that. What's
Right.
that about?
Right.
That would be an incredibly fascinating dynamic to experience, let alone witness.
Yeah, I think I can't remember where I heard. It might have been the Imaginary Worlds podcast, but it was talking about how D&D allows kids to sort of try on personalities. And it's in a non-consequential way. Like, oh, what does it mean to be sort of an anarchist where you're, making these really bad decisions all the time and you're being really annoying, and you'll see your peer group sort of react like, hey, we don't want that around, but it's not in a way that has like this adverse effect. What does it mean to be good all the time? And, does that have an outcome that isn't, so it's really cool to hear about it in the frame of like this sort of adolescent trying on of skins and learning who you are. And I think, humanity in general could use a little bit more of that. I'm just starting to be exposed to this Nordic LARPing tradition, which is like,
Yeah, yeah.
like way deeper. I just completely wrote off LARPing, based on a YouTube clip that I saw in like the early 2000s. And now that I hear about these incredible 2 week long immersive LARPing stuff that's happening in Europe, it's just so cool and fascinating and allows you to try out ideas. Yeah.
Um, okay, so on the note of like having this, trying on different roles, especially being attached to like kids being able to do this and experience this, um, outside of the context of childhood, what do you think is the value of play, of context where there's so much agency?
Yeah. Well, I'm absolutely convinced that the best way to learn is through play. And so, I watch again my son who's 10 or 11 and how effective play is at teaching concepts. And then I think about, I like to mountain bike and I learn more about like lots of things when I'm out there having fun on my bike. I'm learning about the mechanics of my suspension, which is like actually physics, and how like traction works, and I get more into it, but there's always a fun element that's encouraging me to go faster or to do more. And I think in general, the more context that you can convey through experience, the more you can, benefit from that. So in terms of teaching a concept, teaching empathy, uh, being able to relate to other people from different cultures, from different experiential backgrounds, like this is the place to do that. And so, I was around for the web revolution. That was kind of the first job I had, and I saw how fast the the internet and the web sort of became pervasive in terms of like it. I definitely remember a moment where there was one place you went and you could see every website on a single page, and then 2 years later, like that was how you did everything. And I feel like especially virtual reality and augmented reality is going to have that same sort of impact on our lives. We're just not quite at that tipping point where, of course, you're going to like check out the place you want to go on vacation by putting on a headset and walking through that space. Of course, you're going to, learn how to fix this thing experientially by trying it out in VR first, or having someone show you like, here's the place you're going to screw up and this is going to fix it. So in terms of like everything we do, I know that we feel really strongly that this will be the way that we learn together, that we communicate together, that we will, be assisted. Like right now we have these devices that are very crude, like Alexa and Siri, but eventually those are going to be characters with full personalities. Um, I don't know if you watched the Netflix series Altered Carbon, which is an amazing book.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I did. That was actually really excellent. I
but
didn't know it was a book too.
yeah, it's a really cool book. And the series is an expanded universe of that. But my favorite character in that is Poe, who's the concierge of a hotel, but he's really the artificial intelligence that runs the hotel. But he's taking on the personality of Edgar Allan Poe, and so he's basically like an Alexa, but he's got his own agency. He's got his own personality. He has an opinion about things, and he delivers it in a character that is sort of predictable and feels like very well intentioned and thought out. And I think that's a future that seems inevitable, where we have, if you think about the evolution of these characters that we're going to interact with, they are the way that we are going to sort of interact with these mounds of data that we're accumulating now. Because it's a human interface. It's something we've evolved to be really good at communicating with.
Yeah, and I mean the constant line that's been floating around for a minute now is like all of these jobs in IT are so suddenly going to become, hey, you're not building these systems, you are there to explain what it is on Earth that these systems are actually doing.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, it makes sense that the interface that makes the most sense is a character of some variety, something that you can understand on that level, because that's the way that we naturally process large volumes of data,
Yeah, and I think
biologically.
I think theatrics and emotion and all of that is going to be just as relevant as just the raw data crunching of it, because those are the things that we pick up on, is like the tone of voice and the delivery of a line. And like right now, it's really easy to disregard Alexa or Siri because you see the seams of the technology constantly. It breaks presence constantly, and therefore it's easy to feel like this isn't an entity that I trust. It's not an entity that I respect necessarily. And once you add emotion into that, it's going to be a lot more reciprocal. I think it's going to be a two-way street where you're learning and can teach. Yeah, so I see a lot of crossover and convergence happening with all of this stuff. Again, it just feels inevitable. It feels not tomorrow, but it feels like it's going to happen. And so, kind of fascinated with being a part of that.
Which is in and of itself somewhat of a siloed perspective because I think that that's certainly true, but the feeling that it's inevitable, I think, is something that many have not necessarily latched onto, given the whole, future is here, it's just not evenly distributed.
Right.
We're based in Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so from our perspective, or from the perspective that is kind of the cultural zeitgeist here versus that of San Francisco, the feeling of inevitability there is still ways down the pipe insofar as, speaking about these things, if someone doesn't have the background context for why this makes sense, they're like, "Oh, that's crazy. That doesn't make sense. What do you mean?"
Yeah, it's funny
Um,
though. They still come true, and all those things that were science fiction to us when we were growing up, are starting to just show up, and it happens sort of incrementally and not in an obvious way. But you pick up an iPhone and you're like, this is absolutely a device that was on Star Trek. There's no question, right? It does more than they even imagined it would on Star Trek. My watch is monitoring my heart rate constantly. It's warning me if it falls below a certain amount. It knows when I've had a hard impact. It can automatically, it's just crazy how incremental but constant the march is of technology. And so, yeah, it is from where you're standing, the vantage point that you have. And I think we were particularly fortunate because virtual reality was this sort of super magnetic moment 4 years ago where all these industries flocked at once. And so we just got overstimulated with potential futures. And we're kind of still riding on a buzz from that.
yeah, and a lot of potential futures that were sometimes very optimistic, but sometimes also neglectful of what the technology was actually capable of because everybody
Totally.
got excited about it
Yeah.
without actually maybe having the knowledge of, hey, this is what this actually takes.
Yeah.
Okay, so though speaking to said potential futures, you had spoken of your co-founder, Edward Saatchi, as a bit of a provocateur in this, right?
Hmm.
With one of the things he had poked out was Lucy is the next operating system, which makes a world of sense. But what are some of the other things? You said he's always throwing things like that kind of into your sphere. What are some of the other things that he has poked at or pointed at in that, right?
The operating system one is certainly a big one. And just to give context, it's like, okay, well, there's thousands of people at Google and Microsoft working on something like that, and we're a small team. So how could we even start a process like that? But that's what's so great about the relationship, is that he does throw out these sort of grandiose ideas, and at first we kind of reject them because we're pragmatic problem solvers, and we kind of they seem too big to solve in some ways. But I, at some point, in our relationship, I wrote down this like, okay, I have to give myself permission to think about the future, because if you're only thinking about how to solve something in a six month increment and deliver it, you're never going to get past sort of just this constant implementation phase. And what we're really talking about is how would you even architect something like that? So, yeah, character does make a lot of sense as the way that we will interface the world, and is likely to happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a visual version constantly in our frame of reference. It could be just a voice, but really it's the idea of memory and persistence that is provocative there, because if a character has an ongoing memory of you and remembers the conversations you've had and remembers the things that you're scared of or your personal preferences, it's the kind of thing that levels up access to all the data that we do interact with. But there have been other conversations around, artificial intelligence. Um, we talked recently about this idea of transhumanism, the moment where people are like, yeah, I don't really want my body anymore. I'm just going to upload myself and live forever. And that's,
Yeah, there's a video clip floating around for audiences that actually touches on that. It's a very, like, comical but strangely contextually real conversation between a daughter and her parents about that kind of thing, which is definitely worth checking out, and I'll link that up in the show notes, but
yeah. And I think, I'm sort of a practical problem solver by nature. So my inclination is to sort of reject that stuff. It's like, yes, that will happen. Probably not in my lifetime. Um, but it's really good to sort of start at the end and work your way backwards. And if you're not doing that in the storytelling, then you're going to fail, right? Because if you don't know where the story ends, how can you possibly set it up properly? And so that's been a technique that we've been using more recently, is to let's start at the end of this journey. There's a popular sci-fi theory that says like the reason we probably will never encounter an alien life form is because by the time a civilization is capable of space travel, they've said like, why would we do that? Let's just upload ourselves to a virtual world that is exactly what we want it to be and live there forever. Um, and so if you start at the end and work your way back, it's like, what are all the incremental steps? What has to be invented? What's likely to be invented? Who's not looking at those things? Who is looking at those things? Should we partner with them? Who can we learn from? Who's the expert in this field? And that's been really informative, because as we take on these more and more ambitious, problems to solve, we can't do it without talking to people who actually know something about these topics, because it will take us 10 years to teach ourselves about nonverbal communication, but we could have a 3-hour conversation with an expert on that and learn just enough to get us like moving in the right direction. And then what I found is those things start to feed off each other. The nonverbal mixed with the artificial intelligence mixed with the third act story structure yields this like really cool sort of hidden magic trick that is unexpected. And that's the thing about magic tricks, is like you don't actually think there's a wizard performing that real magic up there. You're being fooled. You just can't figure out how you're being fooled. And that for me was, when I saw Jurassic Park in the theater, I had to figure out how that magic trick was being done, because that dinosaur looked real. And that's what put me on this path. But, I think, yeah, going for the crazy idea is kind of a fun exercise, and it brings you back eventually to the problem at hand.
I love that, though. It all started with the T-Rex.
It totally did.
All right, so I know we are coming up on time here. I have just one or two more brief questions before we start wrapping up. Just to make sure, are you good on time constraints for like another 5 minutes or so here?
Sure.
Awesome, awesome. And of course, please let me know at any point in time if you have to cut. So on the note of us moving from kind of materialism to experientialism to wanting really unique and personalized experiences. Um, what do you feel like kind of is propelling our culture that way? And I know this is a really ambiguous question, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts in that direction as far as why that's happening.
Yeah, it's obviously the internet has really changed the way that we see the world. I think um, it goes from localism. So, just to back up and sort of explain that sort of premise a little bit more, when I grew up, I was a kid of the 80s, and that was the things generation. Like, you had to have fancy cars to get attention, or big house, or fancy clothes. And all of the entertainment reinforces that. Go back and watch a movie from the 80s, and those were the things to strive for. But it was also a local thing. You sort of, like, your social group was either the town you lived in, or the city that you were a part of. And the newspaper would inform you with a fairly significant delay of events, and you'd only hear then what was being sort of curated for you in terms of information. And now we're living in what is sort of referred to as this experiential generation, or the experiences generation. And the internet has heavily informed that, and specifically things like Facebook and Instagram have informed that. So it's, instead of the big car and the big house, it's check out this, like, one of a kind meal I'm having at this fancy restaurant, or check this place out, I'm on vacation here, here's a selfie of me. And selfie is probably the best indication of that. But we're much more informed globally about what's happening. News is, like, happening so fast, we're almost desensitized to it. But we hear about the smallest thing in the farthest away place almost immediately. And I think that's changing how we look at information, and what we value. I think it's less about, the spectacle of being locally the wealthiest person or having the fastest car. And it's more about, like, look, I've experienced more of the world, this world that we know much more about now. I've had this cuisine and things like that. And so we're trending towards, um, hopefully, a more empathetic model, which is, I'm putting myself in the context of others. I'm experiencing other people's experiences and cultures. And that's a bragging right now. So the motivation is still questionable, but the net result is a positive one, in that we're seeing more of the world, we're hearing more of the world, we're unifying as a culture. And I think that trend will continue towards, now here's a thing that is specifically for me. It understands who I am. It's uh, it's catered to my needs, both in a positive and a negative way. It might know what I'm afraid of. It might know what I love. And as a storyteller, and as an educator, and as someone that wants to connect people to other people, those are incredibly powerful tools. So I think that trend, sort of what I see as this either tailored generation or custom generation, is what we will experience next. And we consume shows like Game of Thrones now because we get 20 to 40 hours with a character. Think of what that would be like, you know 2 to 4 years with a character, or 10 years with a character, and then that character would remember everything you ever said to it, and have experienced things directly, like in a Dungeons and Dragons experience with you. And so there's direct context and memory about those events. And then you can weave that into the storytelling or the educational process. So, whether we call that the unique generation or the contextual generation, I think that's where we're headed. And I think that's the potential of AI is there, um, to do that. And it's only going to get better. So that's kind of where we are.
Definitely. Thank you for that perspective. And just as a very last question to cap us off here, for anybody who would want to learn a little bit more about kind of this level of communication and storytelling and all the work that you guys have done, is there anywhere, any books, any resources, lectures, etc., that you would point people towards who might want to learn more about this kind of new world that is unfolding before us?
Yeah, I think if we haven't already, we'll certainly list a bunch of the stuff up on our website, which is fable-studio.com. And we're also hosting the first Virtual Being Summit in a couple weeks here in San Francisco, and that's virtual-beings.ai. And that's sort of the first time like all of these companies that are experimenting with these characters that are becoming aware in different ways, which is super cool to just see there's like a whole industry starting and without really even talking to each other. And so we're going to gather all those people together and chat about goals and hopes and objectives and concerns, just moving forward. So those are two resources. Trying to think if there's anything else. There's definitely a lot of like little articles floating out around the web about wolves, and we'll try and pull those together on our website as well, because we do sort of break down our process and share a lot of like how and why we did the stuff that we did. So yeah.
Definitely. Wonderful. And then, of course, you just mentioned a couple of places that people could find you. Anything that you would like to ask of the audience or place you would point them to experience what you guys are doing or kind of learn specifically about Fable Studios?
Yeah, so Wolves will be released very soon on the Oculus Store, it's at various festivals as well. We just finished showing part 1 at Tribeca, and part 2 will be out probably in the fall sometime.
Well, wonderful, wonderful. All right. Well, with that, I think we are coming to a close of our time. I just want to say thank you again so much for taking a bit of your afternoon here to chat. And I think that our audience will most definitely appreciate your thoughts on this matter. It's a very different lens and frame of reference, but I think it very much is the forefront of what immersive is becoming.
Awesome. It's really awesome to talk to you.
You as well. All right. Have an
Cool.
absolutely wonderful afternoon.
You too.
And of course, for any audience listening, you can find all of the references and mentions that we have touched on throughout the show at immersionnation.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you for listening. Calling all immersive adventurers, explorers, connoisseurs, and artists. The immersive revolution is just beginning. All that is to say, we would love any feedback that you might have on the show. What do you want to hear more of, less of? Anyone in particular you'd like us to have on the show? I would love to hear your thoughts. So please rate us, review us, or just drop us a line on the website at immersionnation.com. I always love having conversations about this wide and wild world that we are both living in and creating. Once again, this is the Immersion Nation podcast. Thank you for joining us in this adventure.